Yeah.
Yeah.
Report that you release, is it going to be available online, or is it only hard copy today?
Definitely going to be online. I just don't know if it's already live or.
It's live? Okay. I'll check it out.
Once it comes in, I'll show you the guide. We would know for sure.
Okay. Great. Because I'm looking through. It has some great content. I'd love to draw from it and whatever comes out of this.
Great. Thanks so much for coming along. I don't know. You probably don't know my new coordinates.
You've changed.
I'm an independent consultant now, so but still working with these guys on things like this. But yeah, we haven't met yet in person, have we? Yeah. I'm so glad you were able to brave the weather. And let me introduce you. This is Bob Berg. This is Isabel Hoagland from Inside U.S. Trade.
Oh, terrific.
This is Odell. Ask him about the. Odell, is it online? Is the report live yet?
The report?
Online?
Yes, it should be. Let me check and make sure.
This is Isabel. She would like to know here.
Do you have a card or is there an email?
Hi there.
So what are your plans after?
I'm going to be at the University of Michigan at the Public Policy School.
Oh, that is great. That's great. And a free reign to do whatever.
I don't know about that.
That's great. Stimson is a medium-sized think tank, nonpartisan.
How did it start?
It started because people wanted to look at security issues, and on a nonpartisan basis.
Where's the name come from?
Henry Stimson, the former Secretary of State.
I thought maybe so.
And
Named after him.
It's now somewhere in the $10 million, 50 people on staff.
That man, huh?
And a good reputation. And I brought to this program, can we recognize that we know how to treat the poorest countries and the richest, but most of the countries in the middle, and we really haven't designed very much with them. We have. I felt this when I was in Hague. You could say when you graduate a country, when you graduate, open new opportunities, good things happen. Oh, that was why don't you exactly tell me, please, what are we offered? So this is a chance to really look at that. We had a very good panel last week on AID experts looking at Mark Green's number one goal is to end foreign aid in an orderly way. So the question then is, what happens then? And how are we preparing for relationships with these countries? I think so. Look at this. We've got seats filled. Oh, it's exciting.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, welcome. My name is Brian Finlay. I'm the president and CEO here at the Stimson Center. Thank you for coming out on such a beautiful day in Washington, D.C. And braving the Washington, D.C. summer. We launched this program that is focused on what we call the middle majority, middle-income countries around the world, and specifically on trade with those countries when our biggest concern in the trade space was that we were losing ground with, we feared, that certainly growing subset of governments around the world, some of the fastest growing and fastest paced economies around the planet. Things have changed slightly in the trade space since we launched this initiative, and I'm sure some of that will come up today. It's witnessed by, I think, the jittery markets and concern not that we're just simply losing ground with middle-income countries around the world, but that we are losing a ground with some of not just our peer competitors, but some of our closest allies in the trade space as well. I'm sure we will touch on those issues as well. But suffice to say, this report that hopefully you have in your hand is the result of some deep dives that my colleagues, whom you will hear from here this afternoon, have been focused on in terms of engaging with those middle income countries. For those of you that are not new to Stimson, you may be thinking, why is a national security think tank focusing on this trade issue at this time in the nation's history? And it is, I think, it is really derived from the simple fact that it is our belief that trade and security are really inextricably intertwined. And perhaps like no other issue on the policy agenda here in Washington, the trade issue really does have the opportunity to not just promote mutual prosperity with our partners abroad, but mutual security with our partners abroad as well. And so that's why we are doing this. And I want to commend the efforts of my colleague Nate Olson, whom you will hear, as well as Robert Berg, who is our maestro for this afternoon's proceedings. Bob, for those of you who do not know him, has had a truly remarkable career here in Washington and internationally, working for not just the U.S. government, USAID, but also international institutions, the OECD, the UN, and you cannot keep a job wherever you go, it seems. He really has had quite a remarkable career and is going to share some of those experiences, and certainly those experiences have informed his good work here at Stimson. But I think most importantly, what I would say about Bob is that he has a remarkable, an endearing, and indeed a humbling commitment to the world's most vulnerable people, particularly in the economic space, but certainly in the security and elsewhere, in other aspects of human deprivation as well. Bob, thank you for all you have done in your career. Thank you for all you have done for us in launching the new majority program here at Stimson, and for pulling this remarkable panel together today. I give you Robert Berg, ladies and gentlemen.
Oh, wow. It's like a graduation ceremony. Well, thank you very much. Brian is an amazing fellow, even though he has so far unsuccessfully been able to shed his Canadian heritage of decency, intelligence, and kindness. But I just can't believe that all these years in Washington you haven't learned anything. So welcome to you all, very distinguished panel colleagues and very distinguished audience. I particularly want to thank Irving Williamson for being here, who is a commissioner on the U.S. International Trade Commission and at the forefront now of working on big-time policies. Why our concern with middle-income countries? Well, 4 reasons. Collectively, they are our largest and most promising markets. Second, they are the majority of the world's countries now, and increasingly needed in a more pluralistic, power-sharing world. Third, USAID is pursuing a policy of accelerating graduation of countries from aid, but from aid to what is our question? What does graduation mean? It means to us individually, when we get a degree, that we're opening up new opportunities, we have wider relationships. Is that true of the middle-income countries or not? And fourth, as Brian so rightly said, there is competition. We have had no answer to the Silk Road. Corridor talk in Latin America and in Africa similarly say, well, your work here is nice, but would it take place if it weren't for China? Do you really have an interest in longer-term relations with us, or is this just short-term power? And nowhere does this topic come up with more consequence than in trade relations. What is our current vision?
Whose is that?
If it's for me, I'm busy. Okay.
I'll call you back, okay?
Okay.
It's my son. I always say I'll answer, but that was the shortest answer I've ever given. I'm very sorry. I'll turn this off.
It's okay. You're so senior. You do whatever you want.
Yeah, I learned. That's not true.
So nowhere does this topic come up of relations with middle-income countries more than in trade. And And the question is, what is our current vision of trade relations with the middle-income countries? What should our vision be? So obviously we're not in a normal period of trade relationships. Only the ghosts of Smoot and Hawley would be comfortable now. Trade wars between the biggest traders are not just between them, but as the well-known Swahili proverb says, when elephants fight, the grass gets hurt. The empirical evidence is that everyone gets hurt from trade wars, but that the poorer the country, the worse the hurt. Nate Olson and I have some views on what trade policies towards our most promising trading partners should be, which we'll present in the paper we're discussing today. And particularly in this time of trade chaos, it's important to know where we want to wind up. What's the right course? To help determine this, Nate has interviewed a very large number of corporate and governmental leaders on this topic. He's scholarly and careful with a decade of trade and program experience, and he's now consulting with a wide range of fairly desperate corporations wanting to know what to do next.
I don't know if they characterize themselves that way, but yeah.
After he presents the paper, we'll turn to Congressman Sandy Levin. I had the pleasure of working with Sandy at USAID, where he held a position that is diplomatically ranked as an Assistant Secretary of State, only the aide equivalent. Others at his rank, I found, were sometimes filled with themselves, but Sandy was the real deal. Smart, candid, caring deeply, thoughtful as could be, thinking broadly and wisely before he acted. Since then, and with these same distinguished characteristics, he's continued his work on our country's behalf as a congressman, now in his 36th year in Congress and his last year in the House, working on a wide range of issues with a special emphasis not only on trade for economic reasons, but on the quality of trade as it affects workers and our environment. Anyone else would be in his victory laps at this point, but not Congressman Levin. He still has those Canadian-like traits, self-effacing, decent, dedicated, truly a role model for us and our kids. And speaking of excellent people with outstanding human qualities, we will then hear from Florie Liser, who is president of the highly respected Corporate Council on Africa. Florie is a trade pro with very senior U.S. trade rep positions and Commerce Department as well. And she has fostered trade and investment everywhere, but particularly with Africa, where at least a third of the countries are middle income and another third are on a doable path to be middle income countries. Florie is an inspired choice to lead the council, and we're very pleased that she's here today. So Nate, start us off. What's the arguments?
Yes, sir. Thank you very much, Bob, for that very kind introduction. And I should say, with the balance of the panel here, I should probably just quickly do my business and get out of the way, because I know we want to hear from our other distinguished panelists. But it's a pleasure, first of all, let me say, a pleasure to be back at the Stimson Center today, working with, particularly having worked on you, Bob, with this on this project for the last months, and a very important topic. I really, in the first instance, I agreed to take up this work with you because of, well, for two reasons. Really, one is that I fully share your opinion about the central premise of the program you lead on the importance of U.S. relationships with middle-income countries, particularly the trade and economic relationships. And the second reason is the urgency of our moments as it regards trade policy. Let's be candid. U.S. trade policy is not in a good place right now across the board. The current administration has taken an approach that is at its core protectionist. That's putting it charitably, I think some would say. When engaging with other countries, its goals are transactional and zero sum, really. And the playbook that it uses to pursue those goals is often based on brinksmanship, as we see every single day in the headlines, no more so than the last few days. In short, its posture is, if you think about it, it's almost fundamentally a defensive one. It's all defense. All the while, as has already been alluded to, other countries are seizing the moment and aggressively seeking to conclude new trade deals amongst themselves and to use all manner of other means to seize global market share. And so the way that I think about our paper that we're releasing today and the main topic of our panel here, it's time for U.S. trade policy to go back on offense, and we need ideas to do that. It's time to start thinking about how we find, to use the administration's vernacular, how to find wins, but in a non-zero-sum way. In other words, in a way that the U.S. and its trading partners both can prosper and strengthen broader international relationships. So, where should we look? Again, the universe of middle-income countries is really full of opportunity. It's today roughly a $35 trillion marketplace when you put them together. So full of opportunity in the here and now, and as Bob alluded to, those opportunities are on pace to grow even more in the next 10 to 20 years as their markets continue to expand. So to gather these ideas and try to give some priority and really to jumpstart this really urgent conversation that we need to be having, we spoke with a number of stakeholders in the private sector, former U.S. government officials, current and former officials at international institutions, and a number of folks on the Hill as well. Before I just give you a quick overview of some of the prescriptions, some of the recommendations that we put together, let me run down a few of the parameters that kind of shaped our inquiry here. We are looking at, we are considering the entire universe of middle-income countries. That's 108 countries that are as diverse as Argentina to India, to Indonesia, to Mexico, to South Africa, to Vietnam. So by necessity, this was in some respects a 30,000-foot level overview, trying to identify the high-level trend lines and the stakes and the relevant goals that the U.S. government and other stakeholders really ought to embrace. At the same time, we have worked hard to try to identify a number of quite concrete and actionable steps that policymakers can take and that other constituencies should encourage, should add. We do not really address in our paper investment issues. We certainly do allude to them and bring them in a number of instances as appropriate, but a deeper dive on investment issues is going to be, I think, a topic of subsequent work by Bob's program, so just a note there. So with that in mind, let me just, as I say, briefly note some of the main recommendations that we have made. And I'll kind of group them into three categories for present purposes. First is under the rubric of needing to overcome the current administration's, I call it bilateral bias. That is, it's kind of first, second, and third priority on engaging one-on-one with other countries and using bilateral trade balances as kind of the first, second, and third metric for the kind of health and success of those trading relationships. That approach is really flawed, we feel, and our interlocutors almost universally agreed with that. So just a reality check to start off with. Under the current administration, despite that iron-fisted emphasis on bilateral trade negotiations, not one country has taken up the U.S. offer to launch new FTA negotiations. We note that there were amendments made to the U.S.-Korea trade agreement, or KORUS, that that's kind of an asterisk that doesn't really reverse this unfortunate trade record. I would note, and it's a glimmer of hope, that last week, I believe, the the Indian Minister of Commerce visited Washington, and reportedly, India and the U.S. are soon to begin high-level bilateral talks on expanding trade relations. Not a formal free trade agreement, I would add, but we'll take positive developments wherever we can get them. But we made a very simple but crucially important recommendation that the United States really re-engage in and again embrace multilateral and plurilateral negotiating vehicles, whether that's under the rubric of the WTO or otherwise. And in that regard, we really wanted to emphasize that there's an opportunity in the Asia-Pacific or Indo-Pacific context, as your vernacular might have it. As you all know, I'm sure the administration has articulated an Indo-Pacific security strategy, particularly in tandem with allies Japan, Australia, and India. We see that there's a kind of a natural fit there for it to complement that security architecture, at least the vision for it, with an economic component, one based on regional engagements. So we suggest that in terms of kind of big targets, that's one place that it would be very wise to look. With that said, we also try to, we acknowledge that an emphasis on bilateral engagement is likely to continue under this administration, and so we try to suggest ways to kind of harness that focus and those energies. And so I'd note that U.S. Trade Representative Robert Lighthizer told Congress in March of this year that his staff had recently begun a review of priority countries for bilateral talks, and yet we've heard nothing. At least I haven't been privy to the results of those talks. One would hope that they would lead to some kind of movement soon. Somewhat more specifically, he also said, Ambassador Lighthizer also said in February of this year, that he was disposed to perhaps launching bilateral talks with an African country to create a model bilateral trade agreement to be used with other African countries subsequently. So with an eye toward that objective, in this report we have encouraged that the administration maybe build on the success and the progress of AGOA, the African Growth and Opportunity Act, to kind of use that as a springboard to finding ways to develop reciprocal trade with African countries, as opposed to obviously a unilateral preferential program that AGOA has entailed traditionally. Now, next big category, getting our own house in order, sort of looking at the U.S. government's organizational posture and its processes for setting strategy and identifying priorities. We echo, in this paper, a recommendation that was made actually in a previous product that Bob and other colleagues put together in suggesting that the National Economic Council and the National Security Council jointly lead a strategy to identify the direction for U.S. trade with middle-income countries. But also, I would add that we encourage, or we really underscore, the importance of the U.S. Trade Representative continuing to play its statutory role. That is to say, its lead role on the trade policy-making function, as well as leading U.S. trade negotiations. Clear roles and responsibilities on trade and economics more generally has been a source of constant frustration and questions under this administration. It's often the case in a new administration, but to some extent that uncertainty, that ambiguity lasts. So we wanted to underscore that point. We also, this being appropriate, I guess, whatever month it is these days in Washington, it's appropriations season, given the way our funding cycles work. But we also recommend continuing to fully fund all U.S. trade and commercial diplomacy agencies. This is a topic of a lot of consternation and division within Congress, between Congress and The White House, we shall see whether they hold the line this year on agencies like the Export-Import Bank, USTDA, OPIC, but we underscore the importance of continuing to fund those agencies in the immediate term. For the longer term, in the long term, as economists like to say, we would like to see a fully thought out and whole of government effort to chart options for maybe a recalibration of agency roles and responsibilities. But that's something to come after we get through the current kind of moment. In all of this, it is, I can't overstate this, it is imperative that Congress have a central role. I imagine others at this table would have views on the topic. I would note just yesterday, I think, dozens of trade associations delivered to Congress a letter encouraging Congress to really reassert itself vis-a-vis the executive branch in managing U.S. trade policy. Kind of an extraordinary topic for the business community to speak up on, kind of down in the weeds, but also very politically fraught, very important. And they're onto something. It's a thread that runs through all of our recommendations, and that we really need to continue paying attention to. And then briefly, a couple other high-value target areas that we point out in the report, and that I would just echo here. Digital trade, a kind of the infrastructure of the modern global trading system is digital platforms, and we recommend something very specific about in enhancing executive branch reporting requirements on the digital trade goals it pursues. But this is something that would reverberate, to the benefit of many U.S. Industry sectors, particularly the services sectors. And then finally, in the area of trade capacity building, we urge that, first of all, the U.S. continue to fully support implementation of the World Trade Organization's Trade Facilitation Agreement, and we further encourage that it prioritize energy and transport infrastructure in its specific programming under that umbrella. So it's a lot of disparate kind of topics and recommendations, but to kind of conclude my remarks for the moment, let me step back for a moment with some perspective and say that we have no illusions that this is necessarily going to be easy. It won't be. And indeed, the current administration and all of the chaos that its policies have brought, setting all of that aside, it was always clear that U.S. trade policy has needed a rethink in this moment. It's far from being a phenomenon of only the last few years. Anxiety over the direction of the global economy, it's been a long time in the making. By the same token, we can take heart in noting that there's been a lot of hard work done to bridge these gaps in the development of U.S. policy. Just as one example, the so-called May 10th agreements was a hugely important achievement. Congress and the executive branch, Democrats and Republicans, came together to identify shared labor and environmental priorities for both the substance and implementation of free trade agreements with Peru, Colombia, Panama, and South Korea, and all but Korea amongst that group. All but Korea are middle-income countries. That was 11 years ago. As Mr. Levin can certainly tell us, there have been challenges in staying true to the letter and the spirit of the May 10th agreement. But we need to stay focused on grappling with those challenges, because you better believe that those challenges and others like them will continue to confront us as we seek to expand trade relations with the middle-income countries and indeed beyond. So I'm glad we're having this conversation today.
Thank you. Congressman, a pleasure to call upon you.
Oh, thank you. This is kind of a respite for me, and I appreciate the chance from other matters, though it relates to trade. But this is a chance, I think, to have a serious discussion. I wasn't quite sure how to approach it, so I called Alex Shacko, who's here. We were colleagues in AID some decades ago, and he's been deeply immersed you have in international organizations since then. And I have in a different way and not with the same depth. So I decided, and now I'm more encouraged to do it, looking at who's here. There are a few of us of my generation, but most of you are of a much younger generation. And I think that gives us an opportunity to talk about, as you said, the need to rethink. You said earlier we need to go on the offensive. The problem is, on the offensive to go where? Because in a sense we're now on the offensive. A lot of us find it at times offensive, but we're on the offensive. So let me, in a few minutes, I'm not sure how much time we were allocated. This gives me a chance to kind of boil down a theme that a few of us have been urging for a long time without very much success, I think. Some success. In a few words, I think we've had a failed structure of trade policy. It has really failed to address the changing nature of globalization, and it has failed to seriously look at the impact of trade. And so I thought I would take just one example of that, and it might seem critical, but I'm trying to be constructive. On page 8, it says this: the breadth of opportunities for trade with middle-income countries is truly global. Recent U.S. trade policy achievements only begin to illustrate this breadth. Notably, all 6 U.S. trading partners under the Dominican Republic Central America Free Trade Agreement, CAFTA, are middle-income countries. CAFTA, DR, is one of only 2 plurilateral trade agreements to which the U.S. is party, the other being NAFTA. The vast majority of middle-income countries hold further economic potential that can be unlocked with free trade agreements. I think that that is not an adequate description. The truth of the matter is that CAFTA is a almost complete failure. We opposed it after a number of us went to Central American countries where people were working in mostly apparel facilities, mostly women, making $1.25 an hour under horrendous conditions, including conditions, as we were told, included sexual assault. And I don't want to draw easy conclusions, and it's tempting to do that, and I think our president is always doing it and often wrong, drawing conclusions. But I don't see how anyone can argue that our trade policies vis-a-vis Central America have been a success. Indeed, and we fought CAFTA and came within 2 votes of defeating it, because when it came to conditions of workers, the language was countries, their requirement was to enforce their own laws. And those laws were horrendous. And I think one of the consequences, there isn't a one-on-one connection, is the exodus from Central America. And this country is now caught up in the tragedy of the consequences of effective economic development in Central American countries. So I think we need fresh thinking. And as we look at middle-income countries and their potential and the impact of trade, I think we need to think again. And I think the failure to do that led an opening to this argument about multilateral or bilateral that is often, I think, very counterproductive. I don't think the president has the vaguest notion of where he would go with the notion of eliminating multilateral and doing it just bilaterally. In fact, I don't think, Alex, you and I were together, but 15 years ago I went to Columbia, I think, to argue multilateral versus unilateral. And I think underneath that issue is a basic question. Has trade policy been at all successful in addressing the changing nature of globalization and this basic question, the impact of trade policies? And I'll just finish with this thought with this next sentence. The vast majority of middle-income countries hold further economic potential that can be unlocked with free trade agreements. It kind of got lost. But one of the basic issues in the TPP controversy was Vietnam. And whether we should proceed with TPP, in part because in Vietnam there was a completely state-run economy with workers having zero ability to represent themselves, and Vietnam essentially using its authoritarian economic structure as a method of competition. And so it's tempting to talk to business organizations about moving to Vietnam because it is a thriving in some respects economically. But the way it's proceeding is also undercutting other efforts, like one in Cambodia, where for the first time the labor movement joined the rest in trying to establish a structure where workers would have rights there, and there wouldn't be simply a race to the bottom in terms of where apparel production went in the world. And essentially that experiment was destroyed by competition with countries that essentially could undercut even workers getting a dime more an hour. So my plea is, and I'm glad I have this opportunity, for all of us as we object to what I think is this hyper-nationalistic approach, to ask ourselves what kind of a trade policy we want in its place. And so I'll just finish with this, because it relates to national security. And it's, I guess, appropriate, since I'm at Stimson, to comment on that, if I can find it. It's right here. Nearly a half a century ago, Thomas Schelling argued, trade is what most of international relations are about. For that reason, trade policy is national security policy. There's some truth to that. But one of the problems with TPP was that it began to be sold as necessary for national security, kind of overshadowing what its economic impact was going to be on other countries and the United States. So my feeling was, and I expressed it at the time, that economic policy sound is necessary for national security. It relates to it. But national security should not totally drive the nature of trade policy. And the previous administration began to try to sell TPP as necessary in terms of military security, national security policy, especially as to vis-a-vis China. And the result was it lost ground because it was hard in many respects, or some respects, to defend it in terms of economic policy. So I want to close with this, and I appreciate the invitation because it gave me another chance to say this. The people who essentially defined trade policy in substantial measure are to blame or responsible, or let me put it more correctly, left an opening for those who essentially wanted to replace an internationalist, multilateralist economic policy with something that was nationalistic, and if you want to put it, America first. And it was our failure, or the failure, to really rethink trade policy that left an opening for those who essentially want to, in many respects, turn trade policy on its head. And this has been coming for a long time. The term trade war has been used every single time we tried to change trade policy. And almost every time, and this was true of May 10th, that really wasn't a bipartisan effort. It was a few of us, if I might say so, and the Republicans accepted it because they thought it would be an avenue to approve further trade agreements. And the problem was that got lost was the importance of trying to change trade policy through May 10th as a beginning, to really begin to ask what were its objectives. Was comparative advantage, which was always used as the argument for the status quo, effective anymore when economies were of such a different nature? Comparative advantage doesn't work when it relates to the steel crisis with China. It worked when there was competition between two like economies or sets of economies. But China essentially has adopted an economic policy that isn't comparative advantage, but is comparative disadvantage. And the result is that we are engaged in an immense debate in this country but unfortunately, and I do close with this, we lost so much ground in talking about redoing trade policy that now it's hard to be heard. And the dominant voices now are taking us somewhere where we don't know where it will end, and I don't think they do either. So with that cheerful report, I turn it over. Actually, I am kind of optimistic because I think out of all of this will force us to rethink, to stop using language that obscures the issue, and to really face up to what do we want as a new trade policy in this country. And I hope that this paper will be one of the sparks to force us to talk about that.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you for inviting me.
Florie.
Thank you. Thanks so much to Bob Berg and the Stimson Center for inviting me to this very timely and interesting discussion. I will say right off the bat that while involved in trade for a long time, my focus has largely been on Africa. And one of the things that has been beneficial, I was listening to the Congressman, one of the things that has been beneficial, at least in the context of Africa trade policy, is that it has largely been bipartisan compared to even Latin America, where there were members of Congress who could not vote for CAFTA, DR, et cetera, pretty much through all the years of AGOA, the African Growth and Opportunity Act, which was first put in place in the year 2000 under President Clinton, and through succeeding presidents and probably 3 iterations of AGOA, members of Congress on both sides of the aisle and in both houses have been very supportive of AGOA. And I believe that times may be changing a bit in terms of where we may be heading with Africa, going beyond AGOA and unilateral preferences. But I think that in general, there is still a sense that there's a lot of opportunity there. So obviously with the report, I was very interested in reading it, noting that middle-income countries in the world account for about 70% of the world's population, and I think a $35 trillion market. This is a good time to be focused on where do we go next, what's our next policy. And I think from the point of view of USG policy writ large, as well as the business interest of companies, this is an appropriate time to think about where are we going to go. I was trying to look up yesterday to get ready for this how many trade agreements are out there now that are not U.S. trade agreements. I think we have 11, and I think the rest of the world has hundreds of trade agreements. So we're a bit behind the curve if we're talking about bilateral free trade agreements. But again, the question of what is the best way, what's the best platform for advancing U.S. trade interest with our partners, and particularly our developing country partners, I think that's important. I probably should say that a little bit about the Corporate Council on Africa, just to put in context what the thoughts I had on the paper. We are a leading business association. We've been in existence for 25 years, and our sole focus is on promoting the interest of business in Africa. And we both advocate with our African partners to put in place the kinds of policies that make it easier for companies to do business there. Our member companies are both U.S. and African, and they are both multinationals and SMEs. And we are invested all across the continent in low-income countries, middle-income countries, high-income countries, from north to south and east to west on the continent, and invested in Africa's most promising sectors, including agribusiness, energy, finance, health, ICT, infrastructure, tourism, trade facilitation. These are key sectors. And many of the points that are made in the paper about middle-income countries really can also be said writ large about Africa. It's the second fastest growing market in the world. There are 1 billion people with 50% under the age of 20. It has the most rapid urbanization of all the regions in the world, a burgeoning middle class of 350 million people, growing disposable income that's being used to buy goods and services from all over the world and hopefully from the U.S. Internet usage that's growing 7 times faster than the global average, and consumer and business spending that already totals about $4 trillion a year. For Africa, with their fastest growing sectors being things like financial services, agribusiness, ICT, light manufacturing, fast-moving consumer goods, what we know and what I hear all the time from CCA members and beyond that is that Africa is a continent of unique opportunities for businesses, for growth and expansion, and that the continent actually plays a very critical role in the bottom lines of many U.S. companies, something that maybe they don't talk about so much. So some of the same, I think, quote, lucrative economic opportunities over the near, medium, and long term that you talk about for middle-income countries are exactly why U.S. companies are competing with companies from all around the world, not just China. Everybody's always talking about China, but not just China, but the EU, Brazil, India, Malaysia, and many other countries. Companies are in Africa for the very same reasons, because there are tremendous opportunities there. Now, there were just a couple things I wanted to mention regarding the middle income situation in Africa. I think there are 2 important issues. The first is there are some competing or conflicting classifications of African countries. So according to the World Bank criteria, there are 26 African countries that are either lower middle income or upper middle income economies. However, according to the United Nations, African countries account for 33 of the world's 47 least developed countries, and that was as of 2017. You get anomalies like this. Lesotho is listed by the World Bank as a lower middle income country, but it's classified as a least developed country by the UN. And you might say, well, the question, why does that matter? And that really brings me to my second point, which is how countries are treated in multilateral as well as bilateral trade negotiations, the kinds of concessions that they have to make, the kinds of special and differential treatment that developed countries like the U.S. have to actually give to or extend to those countries very much depends on whether they are an LDC, a least developed country, or they aren't a least developed country. So that classification issue of whether or not you're considered a least developed country, whether you are lower middle income, whatever it may be that the World Bank uses, that's what's going to drive the kind of trade concessions that have to be given to least developed countries. Let me just end by noting that every non-LDC African country, whether it's South Africa or Kenya, Ghana, Mauritius, Nigeria, any of the non-LDCs in Africa are all in a regional economic community with least developed countries. And in many cases, they are in customs unions with those least developed country partners in the regional economic community. So Kenya has, Burundi, Tanzania, Uganda, Rwanda, and soon South Sudan, all of which are least developed countries. Kenya is in an odd place, though, because their access to the EU market was being treated differently than their partners. So they were ready to sign a trade agreement with the EU, but their partners, who were least developed and would continue to have least developed country access to the EU's market, were not ready to sign a trade agreement. So Kenya is caught in this very difficult spot where they very much need that access in order for them to keep trading with the EU, and they need that trade agreement, whereas their partners will continue to trade anyway. And the reason I'm raising that is that the Africans, from their perspective, are very committed to regional integration. The East African community, of which I'm speaking now, Kenya, but this is also true if you look at South Africa. They're linked to countries like Lesotho, which is a least developed country. And for a while, from 2003 to 2006, we actually had negotiations for a free trade agreement with the SACU countries. In fact, I was the lead negotiator at that point. And one of the things that would happen is they would say, the South Africans might say, well, we're not really able to give you that concession because our least developed partner, Lesotho, is not going to be able to do that. So therefore, again, that was quite some time ago, more than a decade ago. But what I would say is that, when you look at regional economic communities and the commitments that they've made to each other to stay together as a group and negotiate as a group, to have common external tariffs, the fact that in March the Africans signed on to implementing the African Continental Free Trade Area, and so now there's a commitment for the entire continent to be one market. Everybody thinks it will take some time, but that is a commitment that's been undertaken. So, if you look at that, I think what you realize is that if the U.S. is going to identify a concrete policy or negotiating goals, as you put in the paper, for reciprocal trade with African countries, it will have to take into account, I'm not saying it's impossible to do, but it will definitely have to take into account that having a bilateral free trade agreement with an African country or several African countries is going to be pretty difficult to do. Not impossible, but very difficult to do. And so, again, I think that this is something that we have to look at in terms of our trade and negotiating strategies with Africa, the ability to negotiate these bilateral FTAs with select African countries, and the ability of individual middle-income African countries to forge their own trade ties with the U.S. or others. It's going to be very much impacted by the relationships that they have with each other, their commitment to regional integration, to continental integration of their market as well. And so as we think about the middle income issues that you raise in the paper so well, I think that, I don't know if this is true for other regions of the world, but I think that Africa might have some special issues that we'll have to take account of just to try to figure out, okay, what do we want to do with the middle income Africans? But what does that mean in terms of how we engage with their partners who are not middle income? And so I'm looking forward to seeing just how we're going to be able to negotiate that. And from the point of view of companies, they like dealing with regional markets because, of course, lots of African countries are landlocked small markets. If you can deal with 5 countries and establish a larger market for whatever products or services that you sell, then you know, that's going to be more beneficial for a company that's trying to move into a particular market. It's also true that if you can establish in one country and not have to do so in 3 or 4 other neighbors, but can then use that one country entry to access the larger regional market, that's also going to be beneficial for you as a company. So U.S. companies, I think, have a big stake in this debate and discussion about how we move forward in enhancing our U.S. trade relationship with middle-income countries. What will that mean for Africa?
Thank you. This has been very, very enlightening and helpful, and I appreciate these comments. And I just want to add just a couple of points before I throw it open, even though I have about 27 questions I'd love to ask you both myself. Florie, I very much appreciate you helping us understand what other countries' preferences are in this. And I was, working closely as senior advisor of the UN Economic Commission for Africa for a decade, and we kept fostering the notion that when you have a small market share, you have to aggregate your market strength in order to get anywhere, and they're actually now ahead of their schedule in trying to create a whole Africa trading group. And my understanding from a former Assistant Secretary of State for Africa is that not long ago, one of the countries you happen to mention, Florie, wanted to initiate bilateral trade negotiations with the United States, and other African countries said to that country, we're moving to have a trade bloc and don't break it. So there is that dynamic of what are these countries now trying to do. I wanted to also raise one other point, which we kind of had it in the paper, and I'll tell you why we had this point. A good friend who was in Tony Blair's cabinet and is now royally ensconced in the House of Lords said to me, we're going to be shellacked in the Brexit discussions. And I said, why? And he said, because we don't have any good negotiators. I said, really? How can you say that? And he said, well, all the good ones have gone off to Brussels. If you have a choice of working in a growing $450 million trade group or staying in your home country, a declining country of 50 million people, where are you going to go? So it made us kind of think, well, what's our situation here, And it's not that we don't have good folks, but we were saying, well, what if you have a policy of fostering bilateral trade negotiations, how many of those could you do at once with the folks we now have? And we found that the maximum number that's ever been conducted at any one time has been 7. So we thought, well, let's see, you got 108 countries, and what do you tell Peru? Like, we'll get to you in 2045 because, we can only do so many at once. That's why the paper says, whatever your policy is, you have to have the resources to carry it out well. And it isn't just the number, because, Congressman, as you rightly point out, it's the quality of the negotiations and what's taking place that have to be in there. I'm going to now open it up a little bit, and I'd like to call on Commissioner Williamson, a distinguished member of the U.S. International Trade Commission, for the first question and comment.
Thank you. I want to thank all the panelists for some very thought-provoking points they made. I want to get back to something I think has been a concern of Congressman Levin for a long time. And I'll put it this way. I'm concerned about sustainable economic development globally and in the United States. And I don't think you can't have a good trade policy unless you have a good domestic economic policy. And I think some of the problems that we have that are going to, I think, make it difficult to have a good domestic, to have a good trade policy, or to get any trade agreements through the Congress is one, inequitable distribution of income in the United States, failure to deal with our infrastructure, failure to support education, you know, the host of problems that we got. But I think you need to sort of posit that first. We're not going to be able to compete globally if we don't do a better job of dealing with our own domestic economic problems, including worker rights, which is something the Congressman has often mentioned. And that also gets to, I think, the problems you mentioned with CAFTA and the fact that all the asylum seekers we got coming from many countries in that region. Again, is that a good trade agreement, a good trade policy, it has to promote the sustainable economic development, which means it's going to have the benefits equitably distributed. And I also think we've got a rising concern with authoritarian policies and trends in a number of countries. And that also gets to how are the benefits of globalization being distributed. So that's a major concern, and I think it needs to be, you know, we've got to think about that first. Otherwise, I say all the things that you suggest doing, all the tools that you say we should use, all the coordination we should be doing in our policies, I agree wholeheartedly. But just, you got to address this first. I'll just make one comment about the AGOA, African Growth and Opportunity Act. I think one of the great things about that, and I was close friends with the guy who first came up with the idea. And one of the things he thought was important was that some African countries were undertaking economic reforms. In other words, they were helping themselves so they could be more globally competitive. And the idea behind AGOA was to reward those countries. And that's still an important point, getting countries to do things that are going to make themselves globally competitive, because they become much better trading partners for us. And also, maybe then the free trade agreement can be sustainable.
Thanks, sir. Either of you want to respond to the comment, make a comment on the comment?
Well, if I could, actually, I wanted to comment on what you were saying.
Yep.
I think that, for example, if you look at the continent of Africa, and there are 55 countries, I don't think anybody, even the Africans, would say that you want to wait until all 55 countries are ready to move forward at the same pace and at the same level. So I think, realistically speaking, you wouldn't want to be negotiating sort of a least common denominator agreement with Africa as, you know, as a continent. That's not to say that we don't support the African continental free trade area. We definitely do. But I think even amongst the Africans, they recognize, even for themselves, that there are going to be certain champions, quote unquote, around the continent. Mm-hmm. And so if you get all the champions to move forward in a particular way, then what you hope will happen is that some of the smaller countries that you might not sit down to negotiate with. So Bob was mentioning, you know, how many countries can you do at once? I think, at least as far as Africa is concerned, there was no sense ever, even amongst themselves, for the continental free trade area, that they would one country at a time. And I don't think that the U.S. would want to do that as well. Also because we want to keep the standards high. We want to make sure that we look at labor rights and environmental issues and protection of intellectual property and lots of things that are currently not included in African free trade agreements with other countries like the EU. The EU agreements only cover goods for the most part. So, you know, the U.S. is never going to do a trade agreement that only covers goods. I mean, that's just not going to happen. And frankly, if I had been advising the Africans where a greater portion of their GDP is driven by trade and services, I would have told them that wasn't such a good deal anyway, to negotiate a free trade deal with the EU on goods, because they're not as competitive in goods. So, you know, they open up their market and then all these products would be flooding in. I would have told them, you know, start with services, you know, look at mobile, you know, financial services that were launched in Kenya, and look at what's happening in, you know, telephone service there, IT services there, cable and so forth, satellite networking, all of that. I mean, some of the African countries are ahead of us. So I would have told them that that's where they should have started their free trade negotiations with Europe or anybody else, frankly. But I just wanted to comment on the fact that we can't do it one at a time, but we're also not going to do 55 at a time either.
Right.
And so we'll have to depend on some countries that are forward-leaning, whether it's a Kenya, Mauritius, a Ghana, you know, sort of a collection of countries throughout, you know, maybe Zambia, throughout the continent, and they will be the lead. So,
Good.
and of course, I mean, I think that Irv's point about the importance of trade benefits being distributed amongst the people and people understanding how trade benefits them, I think is really critical. Thank you, Irv, for that comment.
Congressman?
Well, as you know, the issue of the impact of trade on income inequality is a critical issue. And we've been urging the ITC to use a model that would probe into that more effectively. And unfortunately, until now, we haven't really succeeded.
More on employment in your studies.
No, there were some steps. But it really gets back, I think, to the basic point that the trade agreements have somewhat have been isolated from the question of their impact, because the basic assumption was, to overstate it a bit, that more trade is always better. I mean, that has been the governing feeling, and even the language of trade reinforces that. You know, the word protect is a positive word. It's interesting what happened to trade policy, and the term protectionism became totally negative. And part of the struggle has been to get us to think about the impacts of trade in terms of the lives of people. And we're paying a consequence now, without my getting too partisan about it. I mean, we're paying heavy consequences for the notion that trade always would work itself out. And there are too many people who disagree with that. And in terms of AGOA, I mean, one of the sad features of the present situation is there's little attention to these issues, including trade with Africa. It's all overshadowed now by this notion that there was a failure to stand up for ourselves. So now it's time to just do that.
I deliberately use the word sustainable as being a little bit more neutral than protect, but it's the same thing. It's not going to work unless it's going to work for the long term, and that means all the things we've been concerned about the equitable distribution and all that. If we don't have that, I don't think it's, in the end, going to be very well.
I'm going to now get a round of questions, and we're going to take notes because we'll probably take about 3 and then have time to respond to them. And I see 3 hands, 1, 2, 3. Isn't that nice? Just like that.
So, since Chief Focus, Richard Ponzio from the Stimson Center side.
introduce myself. Since the chief focus of your program, as well as the paper, is middle-income countries, the Doha trade round, the WTO trade round talks that started well over a decade ago, were supposed to have been extremely beneficial in areas of comparative advantage of middle-income countries, even LDCs, agriculture, textiles, a few other areas. Now, despite, we've seen some progress in recent years on non-tariff barriers and even the trade dispute mechanisms of the WTO gets some acclaim. But of course, shortly after the Doha round started, it got tripped up probably because of the power differential with the EU and its cap protection of its own agricultural workers, and in the U.S. to a lesser degree. Is there a reason, maybe because of what's happening currently, as you described quite effectively, Nate, that we're staying away from strengthening, reforming the WTO? But isn't that the original sin of what created the current conditions today, that the failure of those talks after quite a successful Uruguay round and the WTO's creation? Why are we not at least thinking about beyond the current administration for the way to rectify the multilateral system through the WTO?
All right, the mention was made we needed to go to the younger generation. Young in spirit, Mr. Shakow?
I do feel as though I am part of the younger generation.
You are, right. Me too, Kevin.
I'd like to reinforce the first set of questions, but I also wanted to say that when Brian Finley mentioned that the reason that you're working on middle-income countries and trade is because of their security link, it occurred to me that obviously your influence here at the Stimson Center with the president is enormous, because all of the tariff recommendations that he's making are based on national security, right? So you've succeeded already in getting the influence around town. No, my point was really...
You haven't lost your sense of humor.
Appreciate that.
Everybody knows that aluminum pie dishes are a national security issue.
So following up on the first comment, that at a time when the United States was the dominant global power, it was very easy for the United States to be generous about its international trade policy. But as I think some of you have described here, that this has been eroding over time. And so while I think your paper is terrific, and it does have all the pieces that would be nice to implement, if I understand Sandy Levin's argument, it is that basically free trade has lost its constituency. And that while many, many decades ago or years ago it was there, at the moment you don't have that. And so when you're talking about a policy, what are you going to do to get it back? I mean, that popular reactions are now the ones that will be driving decision-making on trade policy, not necessarily the corporations that you talk with or trade unions. I mean, it's people reacting through their votes. And those votes now, across the board, seem to have lost faith in free trade as we used to know it. So that's my question, is really what do you do now to get that constituency back?
Thank you. Great question.
Thank you for being here today. My name is Isabel Hoagland. I'm with Inside U.S. Trade. And both Wilbur Ross and Robert Lighthizer have cited what they call invisible taxes of doing business with many of the regions and countries in the block of middle-income countries your report includes. And with respect to Latin American countries in particular, they've said those countries need to bolster rule of law, decrease regulatory barriers, and focus on exporting high value-added goods before the U.S. considers trading with them. Have you pitched this report to Commerce and USTR, and what were their thoughts, particularly with those issues?
But say that a bit more clearly, what you think.
I'm saying
We talk about trade
Commerce
all the
Secretary
time.
Wilbur Ross and U.S. Trade Representative Lighthizer have cited issues they have when doing trade with these countries, Argentina, Latin American countries, African countries. Some of those issues include rule of law issues, transparency issues, regulatory issues. So I'm wondering if these gentlemen have pitched the report to Commerce and USTR, and what were their thoughts? How will they move forward in addressing these issues that these officials have cited?
Okay, we can polish off these questions easily. Very, very good ones. And maybe what I'm going to do, given the hour, is ask you to respond and to make your final statement at the same moment. Sandy, you want to go first or last?
Why don't you respond to Isabel's question about, it's somewhat specific. Have you talked to Commerce, to the administration at all about?
Okay. Nate, you
about
go
the-
first, and then
Well-
we'll decide whether you want to go next or last.
We've talked to a handful of people in the administration, many more on the Hill, Republicans and Democrats alike. I expect that we will have follow-up conversations with them now that we have a consolidated set of recommendations here. I suspect, as to the premise that you outlined in terms of the reticence to do business with, or to seek deals with Latin American countries and so on, that I think has a common thread with Richard's point about the architecture of the WTO and how modern trade agreements, whether it's the institutional infrastructure of the WTO, say, or a normal free trade agreement vehicle, are not necessarily fit for the 21st century and all the complex issues that they entail, like regulatory cooperation and state-owned enterprises and so on. And so to kind of address both of these, I think you're going to be hard-pressed to find any countries where those kinds of modern challenges don't exist. And so you can't really let the perfect be the enemy of the good in engaging with them on a one-on basis or in other fora. On the WTO, I think it's widely understood that the negotiating function and the dispute resolution function of the WTO needs to be revisited in some way. It's again, these are kind of the big picture conversations that we ought to be having and that have been kind of unfolding in slow motion for a long time, but now we are consumed with trying just to navigate the exigencies of the current U.S. administration and around the world. So, but your point is well taken. That the WTO has in the inevitable challenges of trying to find success in multilateral fora is going to produce frustration. But those organizations are the sum of their members, and so it's incumbent on us to really try to find ways to improve them.
Thank you. You want to go next, Sandy? Or do
Yeah,
you want me to go
just
next?
quickly,
Okay.
let me comment on the question about Doha and then your
Yeah.
point about loss of constituency. I had the privilege of being at Doha. I guess I was the only member there. It was, after 9/11, etc. And it, in the end, I think the main conflict was between middle-income countries and the developed economies, right? It broke down India, Brazil, etc., conflicting with the U.S. and Europe, etc., Japan to some extent. And I think that was an indication of the need to revisit trade policy and to stop being an automatic pilot. Trade policy's been on automatic pilot. There have been few economists who challenged the status quo when it came to trade policy. It's hard for you to mention very many without my being specific. I got so desperate that I tried to find some economists to help out, and they turned out, several of them, to be kind of neo-Marxists, and that wasn't workable for me. But also, the WTO, their processes are very untransparent. And that left it open for the critics of multilateralism. And then I want to finish with your question, Alex, about free trade lost its constituency. I just cite the example of steel and now the tariffs. Was in terms of steel, in quotes, free trade working? The answer is it wasn't. 10, 12 years ago, China and the U.S. produced the same amount of steel. Today, China, last year, was producing 10 times the amount of steel in the U.S. with their state-owned economy, enterprises, with their essentially manipulating their currency. And we did not effectively address that. We, who believe in the inevitability of a global economy and how you work with it, we did nothing about manipulation of currency except talk. And for 5, 6, 7 years, China did that and essentially eroded the steel industry of this country. So, yes, and it's true, it isn't all the workers, etc., but you ask the typical person in this country, is it working? And they'll say it isn't. And it's been our failure to step up to the plate. And we left an immense opening, and we're paying the consequences. And I'll close with this, because are these tariffs, I mean, where are they going? The problem is this administration isn't using the tariffs or the threats to effectuate a global response to a real problem. China is a real problem, and it is in IT. My first trip to China, I left the hotel, and the first person I met wanted to sell me some stuff that they had counterfeited for $1. And so I hope this report and everything else sparks people to ask the hard questions. Because the failure to ask the hard questions have led to answers that sometimes change every day and sometimes are confusing, perplexing, and we don't know where the end is. But simply don't say it's a trade war, right? The question is, what should our policies be? And this institute has a responsibility, as other institutes, to ask those hard questions and to insist on getting beneath the surface, because when you don't put your hands on the ball, somebody else throws it. Well,
Thank you.
and as to Africa, I mean, the problem in part is all of this controversy now has obscured issues like our policy visa. We extended ago as if that's the answer, right? As if everything's going to fall into place. And we know that isn't true, right? There's a lot of, look, TPP would have, you got me going. It would have affected AGOA, you know? They didn't ask the questions. Some some important production in Africa would have been affected by the terms that were being negotiated. And we asked the question, what's going to happen? Well, it will work out. It hasn't worked out.
So I think I would just, partly in answer to the questions and just to wrap up, I think that I'm unabashedly a free trader, so you all just have to forgive me. I think that there are many U.S. companies, including small and medium-sized enterprises, women-owned, minority-owned, diaspora-owned businesses that are aware that they can sell their goods and services here in the U.S., but that if they want to grow their businesses, at least for many of them, selling their products and services to other consumers outside of the U.S. is also going to grow their businesses. And if they can grow their businesses, then hopefully, not always, right, but hopefully that means more people can be employed by those businesses. Hopefully they can pay people decent wages. And I think that part of the problem with the lost constituency for trade is that many people don't understand how much what they are doing is actually related to the global economy. They don't know, and they don't, people haven't taken the time to educate them and help them to understand. And so, again, I think the only way that you'll regain that constituency is to have people basically know, the products that I make, the services that I sell, here's where they go, and this is how it benefits me. And I would just say on Doha and the behind the border barriers, whether in Latin America or in Africa, I think the point is that if you want to be able to sell your goods and services to other places, then you want a global economy and a global trading system that reduces barriers of all sorts, whether it's tariff barriers, non-tariff barriers, behind the border barriers, and facilitates trade and the movement of goods and services and people across the global economy. So again, I think that from the point of view of Africa, that's what Corporate Council on Africa is promoting. There's a lot of business that's there. We're selling a lot of our goods and services to consumers in Africa. And the Africans want U.S. goods and services. They think our goods and services are high quality, last longer, and are a good value for dollar over the long term compared to some other folks' products. So again, I think a lot of opportunity in Africa. I'm hoping that the middle income countries there will catch the attention of U.S. businesses, and that U.S. policy will be able to support middle income countries there, because if they thrive, I think their neighbors who aren't middle income countries will also thrive.
Let me just make a couple of ending points here. That, to me, the question of middle-income countries is really critical. It really has to do with what kind of a world are we heading for? Are we heading for a world in which we're fighting to hold on to every last shred of power we have, or is it a world in which we understand that pluralism is much more justified? And if you look at voting shares in the United Nations and in the World Bank, you have to say to yourself, we've been slow to recognize this pluralism. There are two kinds of issues, in a sense, when you're repairing the plane while it's in flight. So you have to think about what can you do now to adjust policies in a way that makes some sense, to make sure that functions that are really important for the long term are provided for, and how you can change when you have the opportunities. And then there is, you know, the kind of discussion I had with some leaders at the National Education Association. I started talking about education. They said, well, you know, what could we possibly do? And I said, what you can do is prepare for a post-DeVos world. And so we have to think about the long-term issue, and we have to think about this, frankly, in both parties, where what is the long-term best kind of situation you want to see, and that'll help us know what to do in the next steps on it. So to the extent, since we've all talked about the need here to have a longer view, to have a better view, to have a view that is high quality in its impact, whether it's sustainability or a set of social and environmental goods that are required, and the two sound very close to me. We have homework to do on this, and I'm very pleased that this panel has addressed these issues. Thank you, Irv, for coming here, and Alex and others, and let's see whether we can all do our homework. Thanks so much.
Thank you.